When you think about World War II, you think about beaches, tanks, and soldiers. But the truth is, wars aren't decided on battlefields. They're decided in small headquarters rooms where a general draws a few lines on a map with his finger. Those lines determine how many people will die in the next 48 hours. How many will be captured? How many entire armies will be wiped out? This documentary isn't just about heroes. It's a ranking of the 10 most lethal American generals of World War II. Men whose orders resulted in the annihilation of enemy forces across the globe. Men who didn't just win battles, but erased entire enemy divisions from existence. We normally think lethal means more guns, bombs, or soldiers. But the truth is, the most death comes from the decisions generals make. Where to attack, when to attack, and how fast to surround the enemy. One wrong decision can get your own army killed, but one right decision can collapse an entire enemy army in 72 hours. In World War II, American generals did exactly this. They designed operations where the enemy didn't even realize they had already lost. By the time they understood, it was too late. Entire divisions were encircled. Supply lines cut. Communications dead. And then, only surrender or death. In this documentary, we'll discuss the generals who were architects of this kind of death, who used their minds to trap enemies on a chessboard so thoroughly that there was no escape route left. And when the trapped army surrendered, only then did people realize how dangerous that man was. This list includes some famous names: Patton, MacArthur, Eisenhower. But some names you might never have heard before, because in history, the most attention goes to those who give speeches, wear medals, and stand in front of cameras. But the real workers are often quiet. They quietly destroy the enemy and move on to planning the next battle. This ranking isn't just numbers. It's a combination of psychology, strategy, speed, brutality, and war-winning impact. We're looking at which general didn't just defeat the enemy, but mentally, physically, and strategically destroyed them. So now the question is, who was the most lethal? Whose orders caused the most enemy casualties? Which general broke the spine of the Axis powers? Let's begin. But first, let's understand what lethal really means. If you're thinking this list is based only on how many people died, you're wrong. Lethality isn't just body count. It's impact, it's terror, it's efficiency. In this ranking, we've examined 5 major factors. 1. Enemy killed, wounded, and captured. This is obvious. If a general's operations resulted in thousands or millions of enemy soldiers killed, wounded, or surrendered, then he's lethal. But here's the twist. We're not just looking at direct kills. We're looking at which general put the enemy in a situation where they couldn't even fight. Starvation, isolation, supply cuts, these all count in lethality. 2. Entire enemy formations destroyed. Killing 5,000 enemy soldiers in one battle is one thing, but encircling an entire division and erasing its existence, that's next level. We're looking at which general completely wiped out how many enemy divisions, corps, or armies. Because when a division is destroyed, it's not just soldiers who die. The entire command structure, morale, and fighting capacity finishes. 3. Scale of command. If a general is commanding just one regiment, his impact is limited. But if he's commanding an army group, containing 5-6 armies, hundreds of thousands of soldiers, then one of his decisions can change an entire theater. Scale matters. Because bigger commanders have more resources, more responsibility, and the cost of their wrong decisions is also higher. 4. Speed plus brutality of operations. In war, speed kills. Literally. If you don't give the enemy time to think, no chance to react, then they mentally collapse. We've seen that some generals moved their armies so fast that enemy headquarters didn't even know where the front line was. And by the time they found out, they were already surrounded. This is both psychological warfare and physical destruction. 5. Strategic annihilation. The most important factor is this. Did that general just win tactical victories? Or did he destroy the enemy at the strategic level? Tactical means winning one battle. Strategic means breaking the entire enemy war machine. We're looking at which general's decisions determined entire campaigns. Which general forced the enemy to retreat from front lines? Which general brought the enemy to a place where they couldn't even defend? Based on these 5 factors, we've created this list. And trust me, the names in the top 5, they're terrifying. One last thing, in this list we're only looking at American generals. If we added all Allied forces generals, Zhukov, Montgomery, etc., this list would be completely different. But today our focus is on America's top 10 lethal commanders. So get ready, because now the real countdown begins. Full name: Mark Wayne Clark. Command: U.S. 5th Army, Army. Theater: Mediterranean/Italy. Years active in WW2, 1942-1945. Mark Clark's name isn't very famous, but what he did in Italy was brutal. The Italy campaign was one of World War II's slowest, bloodiest, and most frustrating campaigns. Because fighting in Italy meant battling mountains, rivers, and fortified German positions. Clark was given command of the 5th Army in 1943. His job was to liberate Italy and push the Germans northward, but this wasn't easy. The Germans had turned every ridge, every river, every town into a fortress. And Clark had no option. He had to fight for every inch. In the Salerno landing, September 1943, Clark's army landed on Italy's coast. The Germans almost pushed them back into the sea. But Clark held his forces and established a beachhead. Then began the slow grind northward. The most infamous operation was the Battle of Monte Cassino, 1944. This was a monastery built on a hill. The Germans had heavily fortified it. Clark launched repeated attacks, every time with heavy casualties. Allied forces took almost 4 months to capture that hill. Thousands of soldiers died. But when it was finally captured, the German defensive line broke. Clark's lethality wasn't that he was a genius tactician. His lethality was attrition warfare, meaning he knew there wouldn't be quick victories in Italy. So he started slowly grinding German forces. Every battle, Germans had to take more casualties. Every retreat weakened their positions. And eventually, German forces in Italy began to collapse. In the Rome liberation, 1944, Clark made a controversial decision. He was ordered to cut off retreating German forces. But he decided to capture Rome first, because he wanted to be the first Allied general to liberate Rome. This drew a lot of criticism. But strategically, Rome's capture was a huge morale boost for the Allies. Under Clark's command, the 5th Army pushed Germans almost to the Po River in Italy. Thousands of German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. But it was a slow, brutal process. Clark was called both cautious and glory-seeking. But the end result was that the German war machine in Italy was crushed. Estimated enemy casualties under his command, 100,000 plus killed, wounded, or captured. Why rank #10? Italy was a slow grind. Not many dramatic victories, but there was impact. Germans were pinned down and wasted resources there. Full name: Courtney Hicks Hodges. Command: U.S. 1st Army, Treston, Europe. Theater: Europe. Years active in WW2, 1944-1945. Courtney Hodges' name isn't as famous as Patton's or Bradley's. But the truth is that the 1st Army, which Hodges commanded, did the most heavy fighting in Western Europe. Hodges was a quiet, no-nonsense commander. He didn't give speeches, didn't appear before the media, just did his job, and his job was to systematically destroy the Germans. After D-Day June 1944, when the Allies captured the Normandy beaches, the First Army led the breakout operations. Hodges' forces played a key role in Operation Cobra, where the Allies broke through German defenses and began rapidly advancing through France. But Hodges' real test came when the First Army attacked the Siegfried Line, Germany's heavily fortified defensive line. These were World War I-style fortifications, bunkers, minefields, dragon's teeth. The Germans thought this line was impenetrable. Hodges used a systematic approach: artillery bombardment, infantry assaults, tank support. Slowly, painfully, his forces broke through the Siegfried Line. Every bunker had to be destroyed individually. Every town had to be taken house by house. Casualties were heavy, both his own and the enemy's. In the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, September-December 1944, the First Army did brutal fighting. This was a dense forest where visibility was almost zero. Germans fired from behind every tree. Mines were everywhere. Hodges' forces took 33,000 casualties here, but German casualties were also 28,000 plus. It was an attritional nightmare. Then came the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944. This was Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front. The Germans launched a surprise attack and achieved deep penetration into Allied lines. Hodges' First Army could have been thrown into panic, but he stayed calm and reorganized his forces. The First Army held the northern shoulder and slowed the German advance. This gave the Allies time to counterattack. In the Rhine crossing March 1945, the First Army was the first American force to cross the Rhine River into Germany. This was both symbolic and strategic. Crossing the Rhine meant breaking Germany's last natural defensive line. Hodges' lethality was that he was relentless. He never stopped. His army systematically reduced every German strongpoint, crushed every counterattack, and by the time the war ended, the First Army had reached Germany's heartland. Estimated enemy casualties under his command: 150,000 plus killed, wounded, or captured. Why rank 9? Heavy fighting, brutal attrition warfare, and first major force to enter Germany. But he got less credit compared to Patton. Full name: Jacob Laux Devers. Command: 6th Army Group, Southern France and German. Theater: Western Europe. Years active in WW2: 1943-1945. Jacob Devers is one of the most overlooked American generals of World War II. Most people don't even know his name, but he commanded the 6th Army Group, which included the U.S. 7th Army and the French 1st Army, a combined force of over 400,000 men. And his operations were devastating to German forces in southern France and Germany. Devers' big moment came with Operation Dragoon, 1944, the invasion of southern France. While everyone was focused on Normandy in the north, Devers' forces hit the French Mediterranean coast. The German forces there were already stretched thin. Devers' invasion created a second front that the Germans couldn't handle. Within 2 weeks, Devers' forces liberated major French cities including Marseille and Toulon. These weren't just symbolic victories. These ports were critical for Allied logistics. By capturing them, Devers ensured that the Allies could bring in massive amounts of supplies to sustain the push into Germany. But Devers didn't stop there. His forces raced northward, linking up with Patton's Third Army and trapping thousands of German troops between them. This pincer movement was classic warfare, and it was executed brilliantly. Entire German divisions were destroyed or forced to surrender. As his forces pushed into Germany, Devers faced the Colmar Pocket, a stubborn German defensive position in Alsace. From January to February 1945, Devers' forces systematically crushed this pocket in brutal winter fighting. Over 22,000 German soldiers were killed or captured. The pocket was eliminated. Then came the crossing of the Rhine. Devers' forces were the first Allied troops to establish a permanent bridgehead across the Rhine into Germany. This happened even before Montgomery's famous crossing in the north. But because Devers wasn't as media-savvy and didn't have powerful political connections like some other generals, he didn't get the headlines. Devers' forces then swept through southern Germany, capturing Stuttgart, Munich, and Nuremberg. By the war's end, his 6th Army Group had penetrated deep into Austria. German resistance collapsed wherever he advanced. What made Devers lethal was his multi-directional pressure. While other Allied commanders pushed from the west, Devers hit from the south. This forced the Germans to spread their already depleted forces even thinner. Everywhere the Germans turned, there was an American or French army crushing them. Estimated enemy casualties under his command, 180,000 plus killed, wounded, or captured. Why rank Hag 8? Created a devastating second front, trapped massive German forces, and systematically destroyed southern German defenses. Underrated but highly effective. Full name: Walter Kruger. Command: U.S. 6th Army, SIF Theaters. Theater: Southwest Pacific. Years active in WW2, 1943-1945. Walter Kruger was Douglas MacArthur's field commander, the man who actually executed MacArthur's grand strategies. And while MacArthur got the glory, Kruger did the grinding, brutal work of destroying Japanese forces in the Pacific. Kruger commanded the 6th Army through some of the most savage campaigns of the Pacific War. His first major operation was the New Guinea campaign. This wasn't glamorous island hopping, this was jungle warfare at its most brutal. Disease, terrain, and fanatical Japanese resistance made every mile of advance costly. But Kruger developed tactics specifically for jungle warfare. He used intelligence, surprise, and overwhelming force at key points to isolate and destroy Japanese positions. His forces would bypass heavily defended areas, cut their supply lines, and then let them wither on the vine, starve them out. In late October 1944, Kruger's 6th Army executed one of the largest amphibious operations in the Pacific. Over 200,000 American troops landed to retake the Philippines. The Japanese threw everything they had at Kruger's forces, including kamikaze attacks, naval battles, and desperate ground counterattacks. The fighting was ferocious. But Kruger systematically destroyed the Japanese defenders. Over 49,000 Japanese soldiers were killed on Leyte alone. The Japanese suffered one of their worst defeats of the war. Then came Luzon, January 1945, the main Philippine island and MacArthur's ultimate prize. Kruger's forces faced 275,000 Japanese troops dug into defensive positions across the island. This was going to be a bloodbath. But Kruger was a master of combined arms warfare. He used artillery, air support, armor, and infantry in coordinated assaults that shattered Japanese positions one by one. The Japanese fought fanatically. Every position had to be taken by force. But Kruger's systematic approach ground them down. The Battle of Manila, February-March 1945, was particularly brutal. Japanese forces turned the city into a fortress. Urban combat was house to house, room to room. Over 100,000 Filipino civilians were killed in the crossfire. But Kruger's forces eventually liberated the city, killing over 16,000 Japanese defenders. By war's end, Kruger's 6th Army had killed or captured over 200,000 Japanese soldiers across multiple campaigns. His forces had liberated the Philippines and were preparing for the invasion of Japan when the atomic bombs ended the war. Kruger's lethality came from his methodical destruction. He wasn't flashy. He didn't seek glory. He just systematically annihilated Japanese forces wherever he found them. No escape. No mercy. Complete destruction. Estimated enemy casualties under his command, 200,000 plus killed, wounded, or captured. Why rank #7? Destroyed Japanese forces across the Pacific, executed massive amphibious operations, and systematically crushed enemy resistance in brutal jungle and urban warfare. Full name: Chester William Nimitz. Command: Commander-in-Chief, U.S. Pacific Fleet and Pacific Ocean Areas. Theater: Pacific, Years active in WWE 1941-1945. Chester Nimitz wasn't an army general, he was a fleet admiral. But his lethality was measured not in divisions destroyed, but in entire Japanese fleets annihilated. When Nimitz took command after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was crippled. By war's end, the Japanese Navy was completely destroyed. Nimitz commanded all U.S. naval forces in the Pacific. That meant aircraft carriers, battleships, submarines, and the Marines, who executed island assaults. His decisions determined where the next amphibious assault would hit, which Japanese fleet would be targeted, and how to strangle Japan's supply lines. The first major test was the Battle of Midway, June 1942. Japanese forces were advancing across the Pacific. Nimitz, using intelligence about Japanese plans, positioned his carriers for an ambush. In one of history's most decisive naval battles, American dive bombers sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers in a single day. Japan's offensive capability was permanently crippled. This wasn't luck. It was Nimitz's strategic thinking and willingness to take calculated risks. Then began the island hopping campaign. Nimitz's strategy was to bypass heavily defended Japanese strongholds, seize weaker positions, build airfields, and strangle Japanese supply lines. Every island captured brought American bombers closer to Japan. Tarawa, November 1943, showed how brutal this would be. Marines stormed the island and faced fanatical resistance. Over 1,000 Marines died in 3 days of fighting, but nearly the entire 4,500-man Japanese garrison was annihilated. Only 17 Japanese soldiers surrendered. Nimitz learned from Tarawa. In subsequent operations Saipan, Tinian, Guam, he used overwhelming naval bombardment and air support before sending Marines ashore. Thousands of Japanese soldiers were killed in these bombardments before the Marines even landed. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944, called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw American carrier planes destroy over 600 Japanese aircraft and sink multiple carriers. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. But Nimitz's most lethal weapon was his submarine force. American submarines under Nimitz's command waged unrestricted warfare against Japanese shipping. They sank over 1,300 Japanese merchant ships, cutting off Japan's access to oil, rubber, food, and supplies from its conquered territories. This slow strangulation was strategically devastating. By 1945, Japan's economy was collapsing. Cities were being firebombed. The Navy was destroyed, and Nimitz's forces were preparing to invade the Japanese home islands. Iwo Jima, February 1945, and Okinawa, April-June 1945 were the final stepping stones. Both saw horrific casualties, but Japanese losses were catastrophic. At Okinawa alone, over 110,000 Japanese soldiers were killed. Nimitz's lethality was strategic suffocation. He didn't just win battles, he systematically destroyed Japan's ability to wage war. Every carrier sunk, every supply ship destroyed, every island captured brought Japan closer to total collapse. Estimated enemy casualties under his command, 300,000 plus killed. Entire Japanese Navy destroyed, merchant fleet annihilated. Y Rank 6 commanded the naval forces that destroyed Japan's ability to fight. Strategic impact was massive, but not as direct as ground commanders. Full name: Omar Nelson Bradley. Command: 12th Army Group, largest American formation in WW2. Theater: Western Europe. Years active in WWE: 1943-1945. Omar Bradley is called the GI's General, but don't let that nickname fool you. Bradley commanded over 1.3 million men at his peak, the largest American force ever commanded by a single general. And under his command, German forces were systematically destroyed across Western Europe. Bradley first proved himself in North Africa and Sicily under Patton. But his real test came in Normandy. Bradley commanded all U.S. ground forces during D-Day and the subsequent breakout. After the initial landings, Allied forces were stuck in Normandy's hedgerow country. Brutal terrain, where every field was a fortress. Bradley planned Operation Cobra, July 1944, a massive offensive using carpet bombing followed by armored breakthrough. It worked. German defenses collapsed, and Patton's Third Army poured through the gap. But Bradley's real genius was encirclement. He didn't just push Germans back, he trapped them. In the Falaise Pocket, 1944, Bradley coordinated with British and Canadian forces to surround 100,000 German troops. The pocket became a killing ground. Thousands of Germans were killed by artillery and airstrikes. Those who tried to escape were cut down. Over 50,000 Germans were captured. 20 German divisions were destroyed or crippled. This was systematic annihilation. As Bradley's 12th Army Group advanced across France and into Germany, German units were repeatedly encircled and destroyed. Bradley's forces moved so fast that German commanders couldn't reposition their defenses. During the Battle of the Bulge, while Patton got headlines for his relief of Bastogne, it was Bradley who coordinated the overall Allied response. His forces held the northern and southern shoulders of the German penetration, preventing it from widening, and then crushed it. The Ruhr Pocket, April 1945, was Bradley's masterpiece. His forces encircled over 300,000 German troops, an entire army group. This was the largest encirclement of German forces in the Western Theater. The trapped Germans had no supplies, no reinforcements, no hope. Over 325,000 German soldiers surrendered. 21 German divisions ceased to exist. Bradley's lethality was his quiet efficiency. He didn't seek glory. He didn't make dramatic gestures. He just encircled enemy armies and destroyed them methodically. No fanfare, no drama, just total destruction. By war's end, Bradley's 12th Army Group had killed, wounded, or captured over 1 million German soldiers. His forces had liberated France, Belgium, and large parts of Germany. Estimated enemy casualties under his command: 1 million plus killed, wounded, or captured. Y rank #5 commanded the largest American formation, executed devastating encirclements, and systematically destroyed German forces across Europe. The Quiet Killer. Full name: George Smith Patton Jr. Command, U.S. 3rd Army, Western Europe. Theater: North Africa, Sicily, Western Europe. Years active in WW2, 1942-1945. George Patton is the most famous American general of World War II, and for good reason. He was aggressive, ruthless, and believed that speed kills. His philosophy was simple: attack constantly, move fast, and never let the enemy recover. And it worked. Patton's lethality was psychological as much as physical. German commanders feared him. When intelligence reported Patton's Third Army was in an area, German forces knew they were about to be hit hard and fast. This fear caused panic and poor decision-making. Patton first made his mark in North Africa 1942-1943, where he took command of demoralized American forces after their defeat at Kasserine Pass. He instilled discipline and aggression. His forces then smashed through German positions, contributing to the final Allied victory in North Africa. In Sicily 1943, Patton commanded the U.S. 7th Army in an amphibious invasion. While British forces under Montgomery got bogged down, Patton's forces raced across the island, capturing Palermo and Messina. German and Italian casualties were heavy, but Patton was just getting started. After being sidelined for slapping soldiers in Sicily, Patton was brought back for the invasion of France. He took command of the Third Army in August 1944 and unleashed hell. Operation Cobra's breakout gave Patton his chance. His Third Army exploded across France, advancing so fast that German forces couldn't establish defensive lines. Patton's armor moved 600 miles in 2 weeks. one of the fastest advances in military history. German units were constantly encircled, outflanked, or simply overrun. Patton didn't wait for supplies. He pushed forward, believing that speed and momentum were more valuable than caution. His forces captured over 100,000 German prisoners in August 1944 alone. Then came the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944. While other generals were surprised by the German offensive, Patton immediately pivoted his entire army northward. A logistical nightmare executed in 48 hours. His forces relieved the besieged town of Bastogne and then systematically crushed the German offensive. Patton's drive into Germany was relentless. His Third Army crossed the Rhine before other Allied forces and drove deep into southern Germany and Czechoslovakia. German units surrendered en masse rather than face Patton's onslaught. What made Patton lethal was his aggression. He never defended. He always attacked. Even when supplies were low, even when his forces were exhausted, Patton kept pushing. This constant pressure broke German morale and prevented them from ever establishing stable defensive lines. Patton famously said, "The object of war is not to die for your country, but to make the other bastard die for his." And he lived that philosophy. His forces moved so fast that they created chaos in German rear areas. Supply lines were cut, headquarters were overrun, entire divisions were trapped and destroyed. By war's end, Patton's Third Army had killed or wounded over 500,000 German soldiers and captured over 1 million more. His forces had liberated thousands of square miles and dozens of cities. Estimated enemy casualties under his command, 1,500,000 plus, killed, wounded, or captured. Why rank Hag 4? Fastest, most aggressive American commander. Created fear and chaos in German ranks. Destroyed enemy forces through speed and relentless attack. Full name, Douglas MacArthur. Command, Supreme Commander, Southwest Pacific Area. Theater, Pacific. Years active in WW, 1941-1945. Douglas MacArthur was theatrical, egotistical, and ruthless. He also commanded one of the most brutal theaters of World War II, the Pacific, and oversaw the destruction of Japanese forces from the Philippines to Japan itself. MacArthur's lethality came from his strategic vision. While Nimitz used the Navy's island hopping in the Central Pacific, MacArthur used a different approach in the Southwest Pacific: isolate and bypass. He would attack Japanese strongholds that could be taken easily, bypass the heavily defended ones, and let them die on the vine, cut off from supplies and reinforcements. This strategy was devastating. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers were left isolated on islands and in jungles, unable to contribute to Japan's defense. They slowly starved or were picked off. No glory, no heroic last stands, just slow death. New Guinea 1942-1944 was MacArthur's proving ground. The campaign was brutal, dense jungle, disease, terrible logistics. But MacArthur's forces systematically destroyed Japanese positions. Over 200,000 Japanese soldiers were killed or isolated in New Guinea alone. Then came MacArthur's triumphant return to the Philippines, 1944. 1945. "I shall return," he had promised, and he did. The liberation of the Philippines was one of the largest campaigns of the Pacific War, involving over 600,000 Allied troops. Japanese forces in the Philippines were destroyed. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, saw the Japanese Navy effectively annihilated. On land, MacArthur's forces killed over 300,000 Japanese soldiers during the Philippine campaign. But MacArthur's lethality wasn't just military, it was psychological. He understood the propaganda value of his actions. Every island recaptured, every photo of him wading ashore, every Japanese defeat demoralized the enemy and inspired Allied forces. MacArthur's bypass strategy also meant that by 1945, over 500,000 Japanese soldiers were isolated across the Pacific, on islands like Rabaul, in jungles in New Guinea and Burma, unable to retreat, unable to fight, slowly dying. MacArthur didn't waste American lives taking these positions. He just cut them off and let them rot. By war's end, MacArthur's forces had killed or isolated over 700,000 Japanese troops. His operations liberated millions of people from Japanese occupation. And he was preparing to lead the invasion of Japan when the atomic bombs ended the war. Estimated enemy casualties under his command, 700,000 plus killed, hundreds of thousands more isolated and starved. Why rank #3? Combined military brilliance with psychological warfare. Isolated and destroyed Japanese forces across the Pacific. Strategic devastation. Full name, Dwight David Eisenhower. Command, Supreme Commander. Allied Expeditionary Force Bureau. Theater, Western Europe. Years active in WW2, 1942-1945. Dwight Eisenhower wasn't a battlefield commander, he was something more dangerous. He was the orchestrator of the entire Allied war effort in Europe. Every general in this list who fought in Europe ultimately answered to Eisenhower. And it was Eisenhower's strategic decisions that determined where, when, and how the Allies would destroy Nazi Germany. Eisenhower's lethality was coordination and scale. He commanded millions of troops from multiple nations, American, British, Canadian, French, Polish, and somehow got them all to work together toward one goal: the total destruction of the Third Reich. His first test was Operation Torch, November 1942, the Allied invasion of North Africa. Eisenhower coordinated massive amphibious landings across Morocco and Algeria. The operation involved over 100,000 troops and was the first major American offensive of the war. It succeeded, and German and Italian forces in North Africa were eventually crushed. Then came Sicily, July 1943, and Italy, September 1943. Eisenhower planned and executed these invasions, opening a new front that forced Germany to divert troops from the Eastern Front and France. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were tied down in Italy, slowly being ground to pieces. But Eisenhower's masterpiece was D-Day, June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history. Over 150,000 Allied troops landed on 5 beaches in Normandy. The planning alone was staggering, coordinating air forces, navies, armies, intelligence, logistics, and deception operations. Eisenhower made the final decision to go ahead, despite bad weather. If he had delayed, the invasion might have failed. But he took the risk, and it paid off. The landing succeeded, a beachhead was established, and the liberation of Western Europe began. But D-Day was just the beginning. Over the next 11 months, Eisenhower coordinated offensives involving millions of troops across a front stretching from the Netherlands to Switzerland. German forces were attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, preventing them from concentrating their defenses. When the Germans launched their surprise Battle of the Bulge offensive in December 1944, Eisenhower calmly reorganized Allied forces, gave Patton the green light to counterattack, and ensured that the German offensive was crushed within weeks. Then came the final push into Germany. Eisenhower coordinated massive offensives that crossed the Rhine, encircled the Ruhr industrial region, and drove deep into Germany from multiple directions. German resistance collapsed. By May 1945, Nazi Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Over 3 million German soldiers were captured in the final weeks alone. The Third Reich was utterly destroyed, militarily, economically, politically. Eisenhower's lethality was strategic, overwhelming force. He didn't win through clever tactics or battlefield genius. He won by bringing such massive, coordinated power to bear that the enemy had no chance. Every Allied offensive under his command involved hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks and aircraft, and overwhelming firepower. German casualties in the Western Theater from D-Day to VE Day, over 2 million killed, wounded, or captured. And all of it happened under Eisenhower's supreme command. Estimated enemy casualties under his command, 2 million plus killed, wounded, or captured. Why rank #2, Supreme Commander of the entire Western European campaign? coordinated multi-million troop offensives that destroyed Nazi Germany's war machine. Full name, George Catlett Marshall Jr. Command. U.S. Army Chief of Staff, entire U.S. military. Theater, global. Years active in WW2, 1939-1945. George Marshall never commanded troops in battle during World War II. He never stormed a beach, never led a tank charge, never even left Washington, D.C. for most of the war. But he was the most lethal American general of World War II. How? Because every general on this list, Patton, MacArthur, Eisenhower, Bradley, was chosen, trained, and empowered by Marshall. Every division that fought, every weapon that was produced, every strategy that was executed, it all came from Marshall's organizational genius. When Marshall became Army Chief of Staff in 1939, the U.S. Army ranked 17th in the world, behind Romania. It had 174,000 soldiers, outdated equipment, and no combat experience. By 1945, the U.S. Army had 8.3 million soldiers and was the most powerful military force on Earth. Marshall built this army. He determined which officers would be promoted. He fired commanders who failed and promoted those who succeeded. He didn't care about seniority or politics. He only cared about results. Marshall personally selected Eisenhower for Supreme Commander. He gave MacArthur the resources for his Pacific campaigns. He backed Patton even when others wanted him fired. He identified and promoted Bradley, Nimitz, and countless others. But Marshall's lethality went beyond personnel decisions. He designed the entire American war strategy. He was instrumental in the Germany First policy, focusing on defeating Nazi Germany before Japan. This meant pouring resources into Europe, building up forces in Britain, and preparing for the cross-channel invasion. Marshall also created the Victory Program, the blueprint for mobilizing American industry for total war. Under this program, American factories produced 300,000 aircraft, 88,000 tanks, 3 million trucks, and millions of tons of munitions. Every bomb dropped on Germany, every bullet fired in the Pacific, every tank that rolled through France, they all existed because Marshall created the system that produced them. Marshall also understood logistics. He knew that winning the war required not just brave soldiers, but ships, trucks, supplies, food, fuel, ammunition, all delivered to the right place at the right time. He created the logistics networks that sustained Allied forces across 2 oceans and multiple continents. His strategic decisions had global impact. The decision to invade North Africa in 1942, to launch D-Day in 1944, to supply the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, Marshall was involved in all of these decisions. And here's the chilling part. Marshall's organizational genius meant that American military power kept growing throughout the war. While Germany and Japan were being slowly crushed, the U.S. military was getting stronger every month. By 1945, America had overwhelming superiority in every category: men, weapons, ships, aircraft, production capacity. This wasn't an accident. It was Marshall's design. So while other generals get credit for winning battles, Marshall created the military machine that made those victories possible. Without Marshall, there is no D-Day, no liberation of the Philippines, no victory in Europe or the Pacific. Marshall's lethality is impossible to measure directly. He didn't kill anyone personally, but his decisions resulted in the destruction of the Axis powers. Millions of enemy soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured by the armies Marshall built. 2 of history's most militaristic empires, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, were utterly destroyed by the military machine Marshall created. Estimated enemy casualties under his command, millions, indirectly but decisively. Why rank #1 built the entire American war machine. Every victory, every campaign, every destroyed enemy division traces back to his strategic vision and organizational genius. The architect of Allied victory. So there you have it, the 10 most lethal American generals of World War II. What have we learned? That lethality in war isn't about personal courage or physical strength. It's about decisions. It's about strategy. It's about putting your enemy in a position where they have no good options left. Mark Clark ground German forces to dust in Italy's mountains. Courtney Hodges systematically crushed German defenses from Normandy to Germany. Jacob Devers created a second front that Germany couldn't handle. Walter Kruger destroyed Japanese forces across the Pacific jungles. Chester Nimitz annihilated the Japanese Navy and strangled Japan's economy. Omar Bradley quietly encircled and destroyed entire German army groups. George Patton terrorized German commanders with his speed and aggression. Douglas MacArthur isolated and starved hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers. Dwight Eisenhower coordinated the destruction of Nazi Germany across Western Europe. And George Marshall built the military machine that made all of it possible. These men didn't just win battles. They erased armies from existence. They broke the will of entire nations to fight. They turned the most powerful military forces in history into defeated, demoralized remnants. Some of these generals are famous. Others are forgotten. But all of them share one thing. When they made decisions, thousands of enemy soldiers died. When they drew lines on maps, enemy armies collapsed. When they gave orders, nations fell. This is the reality of modern warfare. Soldiers pull triggers, but generals decide where those triggers are pointed. Soldiers fight, but generals decide who lives and who dies on a massive scale. World War II saw some of the deadliest combat in human history. Over 15 million soldiers died in that war, on all sides, and many of those deaths can be traced directly to the decisions of the men on this list. They were brilliant. They were ruthless. They were effective. And that's what made them lethal. Let's be clear about what lethality means in this context. These generals weren't psychopaths. They weren't killing for pleasure. They were professionals doing their job. And their job was to destroy enemy forces as efficiently as possible to end the war. But efficiency in war means death. Lots of it. When Patton's Third Army raced across France, German soldiers died in the thousands. When Bradley encircled the Ruhr, over 300,000 Germans surrendered, but not before thousands were killed trying to break out. When MacArthur bypassed Japanese strongholds, those soldiers slowly starved to death, isolated and forgotten. This is the dark side of military genius. The better you are at strategy, the more efficiently you can kill. The smarter your decisions, the more enemy soldiers end up dead, wounded, or captured. And these 10 generals were very good at their jobs. But here's what's important to understand. Their lethality ended the war faster. The more decisively they crushed Axis forces, the sooner the war would end. And ending the war sooner meant fewer total casualties on both sides. If the war had dragged on longer, more soldiers would have died. More civilians would have been killed. More cities would have been destroyed. So in a twisted way, the lethality of these generals actually saved lives by bringing the war to a faster conclusion. That's the paradox of war. The more effective you are at killing, the fewer people die in the long run. These 10 generals understood this. They didn't wage war cautiously. They didn't try to minimize enemy casualties out of mercy. They waged total war, destroying enemy forces as completely and quickly as possible. And it worked. Nazi Germany was utterly destroyed. Imperial Japan was brought to its knees. The Axis powers, which had conquered half the world, were crushed. So when we talk about lethal generals, we're not celebrating death. We're recognizing effectiveness. We're acknowledging that in the terrible mathematics of war, these men made the right calculations. They knew where to attack. They knew when to encircle. They knew how to cut supply lines, trap armies, and break enemy morale. And they executed these strategies with precision and ruthlessness. The result? Victory. Total, unconditional victory. But that victory came at a cost. Millions of enemy soldiers died. And while it's easy to think of enemy soldiers as abstract numbers, each one was a person. Each one had a family, a life, hopes and dreams. And each one died because a general somewhere looked at a map, made a decision, and gave an order. That's the burden of command. That's the weight these generals carried. Some of them handled it better than others. Marshall remained in Washington, isolated from the killing his decisions caused. Eisenhower agonized over casualties but pushed forward anyway. Patton seemed to relish combat. MacArthur staged photographs of his victories, but all of them, in their own way, understood what they were doing. They were architects of death, designers of destruction, masters of the art of killing efficiently. And in World War II, that's exactly what was needed. So here's the final thought. Soldiers win battles, but generals decide how many people die at once. The men on this list didn't just win battles, they erased entire enemy formations from existence. They destroyed armies. They broke nations. They ended a war. And that's why they're the 10 most lethal American generals of World War II.